It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. President Trump's Twitter account again made global headlines this week when he bragged that his nuclear button is much bigger and more powerful than North Korea's. Trump made that comment in response to a New Year's Day speech from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Un's address included an overture to South Korea that is now seeing results. First, North and South Korea reopened a border hotline that had been frozen for nearly 2 years. And just today, the two sides announced that next week they will hold direct talks for the first time since December 2016. And despite Trump's bellicose talk, he's even shown signs of backing off. On Thursday, the US and South Korea agreed to delay their planned joint military games that were set for the end of next month. Is all of this a sign of warming relations on the Korean Peninsula? Well, joining me is Tim Shorak, a journalist who has covered North and South Korea for decades. Tim, welcome. What is your reaction to all that we've seen this week? Does even today's news, especially of direct talks between the two sides, signal a shift in how things have been going?
Well, they definitely signal a shift between North and South Korea. The problem is, I don't think the United States is very happy about this development at all, although they have postponed the military maneuvers, the military training that's going to happen. That's still going to happen after the Olympics. But, you know, it's a very good sign. It's a very good sign that North and South Korea have opened this communication line. And, you know, on Tuesday, they're going to talk because North Korea has, you know, that Kim Jong-un said in his January 1st speech that North Korea would be interested in sending a delegation to the Olympics, which are going to happen in February in South Korea. And so they're going to talk about that. And hopefully it will lead to some other kinds of negotiations between the two sides. So I think it's very hopeful, but I don't think the United States has much to do with it. And, you know, if you read, you know, sort of the official line on this in the New York Times and the mainstream press, and you read these quotes they bring up from, you know, Republican and Democratic foreign policy people, there's a lot of like disinterest in this. And there's the thinking that, you know, South Korea is sort of operating on its own as if it's not a real independent country. And that's a real danger here.
Well, Tim, you know, one of those quotes I'm going to read to you is from Daniel Russel, speaking to the New York Times. He was a former Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration. And he says, quote, "It is fine for the South Koreans to take the lead, but if they don't have the U.S. behind them, they won't get far with North Korea. And if the South Koreans are viewed as running off the leash, it will exacerbate tensions within the alliance." So that's not Trump's Twitter account. That is a former Obama administration official talking about South Koreans as running off the leash. What is he referring to there?
Well, he and most other national security people in Washington, whether they're Republican or Democrat, basically see South Korea as an appendage of the United States. And South Korea is on a tight leash. The U.S. basically controls South Korea. It's a very illuminating comment, I think. Extremely arrogant. It just underscores the arrogance of America towards both Koreas since 1945. And you know, Daniel Russel, of course, you know, he's also the same guy who during the Obama administration, you know, said if Kim Jong-un obtains nuclear weapons, he will die instantly. So, you know, Obama and his people, you know, made similar threats against North Korea. They just didn't do it quite as loudly and on Twitter that Trump has done. But that's what I'm talking about. That's the sort of this underscoring you know, the U.S. thinks that, well, South Korea can only do you know, what we tell them to do. And Moon Jae-in has been very, very frustrated since he was elected president last May because, you know, he ran on a platform of trying to defuse the situation by having negotiations and having direct talks with North Korea, and he you know, began his presidency by, you know, proposing military talks and also talks so divided families could meet. And North Korea rebuffed him because North Korea feels that South Korea is too much, is too close to the United States and is basically a pawn of the United States. In that sense, I think Kim Jong Un reaching out to Moon Jae-in government and saying, let's have some discussion, shows that maybe the two Koreas are going to, can move in their own direction and try to diffuse the situation. It's that, by the way, the last talks between them were in 2005, so it's actually a little bit longer than you said at the top of the show. And the last talks were with the Park Geun-hye government, who was overthrown and who was impeached. But those talks hardly went anywhere because the South Korean government at that time had such a hard line against North Korea. So I think there's some real opportunity here, but there's also danger that people like Daniel Russel and his equivalent in the Trump administration can really throw cold water on this and try to torpedo any kind of discussions that go on.
And what accounts for the bipartisan hostility, as you say, towards North-South Korea engagement?
That's hard to say. I think that this is the attitude that most American officials have toward South Korea. It's because of the fact that the U.S. Has operational control of the Korean military during times of war. And the fact that the United States has played such a central role in South Korea militarily, politically, economically for so many years, it just kind of, gives them this attitude towards South Korea that basically is an attitude of a imperial power toward a colony. And I keep saying over and over again, and I keep saying this on Twitter, it's their country. They have a right, if they want to talk to North Korea and, create the peace with North Korea, it's their right, it's their country. And that seems to be something that's very difficult to get through to the national security officials here in Washington.
Right, Tim. And, on this front, this is where I wonder about to what extent this issue is even about the Koreas at all. I mean, we know that Obama made his so-called pivot to Asia, investing a lot of military capital in the Asia Pacific. Now, South Korea is a huge component of that, over 27,000 U.S. troops stationed there. And meanwhile, also, the people behind increasing direct engagement between North and South Korea are not just the South Korean people and the new South Korean president, but also Russia and China have been playing an increasing role. So I'm wondering to what extent not wanting to see their competing powers and not wanting to see something that could reduce the U.S.'s military presence in South Korea, to what extent that drives the animus here towards engagement.
I think for a lot of the national security crowd here, the real enemy is China and China's growth, China's expansion, China's increasing role as a military power. And a lot of American policy, including Obama's shift to Asia, was directed at China. And, they basically have also treated China like it's an imperial power over North Korea, the way that they view South Korea. So the line here still is, well, China's got to do more. And they basically, they've essentially asked China to, force North Korea economically and militarily to give up its nuclear weapons. And North Korea doesn't have that kind of relationship to China, and it's not going to fall under pressure. But China and Russia continually say that this has to be resolved through negotiations and diplomacy, not war. And more recently, the Russian foreign minister has been very outspoken about the fact that he sees that the U.S. is really escalating the situation. He was very critical a few weeks ago of the last military exercises the U.S. did I think they were in November. At a time when North Korea had actually stopped its testing for quite a few days, quite a few weeks, and there was a period of time there where there was an opportunity to sort of begin some kind of a diplomatic approach, and instead, the United States and South Korea started these air exercises where they brought in all the heavy weaponry of U.S. Air Force, the bombers and the attack fighters that would lead an attack on North Korea. And I think this sent a signal to North Korea that, well, they've got to keep developing their weapons. And not soon after those exercises, they did test that very large latest missile, that long-range ICBM. And the Russian foreign minister was very critical of the U.S. because he said that he was given the impression that the U.S. was going to use this pause in North Korea's testing as an opening. So I think in more recent days also that the Russians have expressed interest in playing a role. So, I think the U.S. can't act unilaterally here. And also, the South Korean government under Moon Jae-in has been adamant that there cannot be a war on the Korean Peninsula, and that there cannot be a war that involves South Korea because they know what would it entail. So I think there's some constraints on what Trump wants to do and his people, who I think are being led by, H.R. McMaster, his national security advisor, as well as advisors like, John Bolton from the Bush administration, pushing this very hard line.
Tim, finally, speaking of constraints, looking ahead to these talks next week between North and South Korea, let's say they go as far as possible and they do lead to an effort to make peace. Can that happen without the endorsement of the U.S., given the huge influence that the U.S. has over South Korea with its massive military presence there?
Well, it depends what kind of agreement you're talking about. I think the U.S. is open to reducing the tension in taking steps. They're in favor of South Korea taking steps to reduce tensions with North Korea. One of the things that Moon Jae-in talked about during his campaign, and he's often talked about during his presidency, is opening up as one step, is opening up this industrial zone called Kaesong Industrial Zone that's actually in North Korea, just north of the DMZ, where that was closed during the Park Geun-hye years about 2 years ago, and that would be sort of bring back this sort of economic exchanges that they had at one point, until recently. But U.S. officials have made very clear that would be a real problem for the U.S. if they opened up that Kaesong Industrial Zone. So I think the U.S. would be very unhappy with any kind of agreement that they saw as reducing the sanctions or actually putting in jeopardy these sort of this militaristic pressure campaign that the U.S. has launched. And so South Korea is under some severe constraints also. It's really hard to know what they'll talk about. I think they're probably going to talk at the Tuesday talks about the participation in the Olympics, whether North Korea will send some officials, whether they will send some athletes. I think there's some skaters and skiers who might participate in those games. And that would be some real movement. And, they've said officially, the South Korean government, that they would like these talks to lead to further talks. So I think in the initial stage, it's probably going to be focused on the Olympics. And after all, the U.S. officials, including the Trump White House, have said, you've got to stick only to the Olympics. So, I think we're going to see some real strains. We already are seeing strains in the U.S.-South Korean relationship.
Well, we'll continue to follow how it plays out. Tim Shorrock, journalist who has covered the Korean Peninsula for decades. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.